I met Jamie in Washington, D.C. before the global pandemic hit. Jamie is a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council, a think tank based here in Washington, D.C. He's the former executive vice president of the nonprofit Asia Society and a leading geopolitical expert.
With these tools of the genetic revolution, we are going to be able to fundamentally transform our biology.
He also sits on the WHO's Expert Advisory Committee on Human Genome Editing.
It's really hard to think about the future because we have to think like science fiction writers. We're on an exponential technological curve. And so if you just think logically, like here's what I saw 20 years ago, and therefore here's where I think where we may be 20 years from now, it's not a linear progression, it's an exponential curve. And we really have to think what feel like crazy thoughts. I mean, just 40 years ago, if someone could have said you could have had all of knowledge on Earth in this little thing in your pocket, that would have sounded crazy. If somebody would have said that you could have, we're here in Washington, the text of every book in the Library of Congress stored in something smaller than a single grain of rice, people would have asked, well, what are you smoking? So it all sounds like magic, but this magic becomes real.
Jamie is also a writer of both fiction and nonfiction. His most recent work is the nonfiction book Hacking Darwin: Genetic Engineering and the Future of Humanity. One of the things I found interesting in your introduction is you talked about writing a sci-fi book, which some of these themes, right, and going and speaking to groups and then kind of talking about the reality, and that the audience was actually more interested in the reality. Talk to us about that, and I think that was sort of the launching pad for this.
Yeah, so the reason why I wrote my 2 science fiction novels is before I was doing that, I was going and giving lectures, kind of like I'm doing now, around the country. And I would say, I want to talk to you about science. When you say, I want to talk to you about science, average person, not just in the United States, but around the world, has the same thought, like, oh no, science. I remember high school, science was so scary. So when you say, I want to talk about science, people get really scared. And so the reason why I wrote the novels is, well, I would say, well, I'm going to tell you a story, and I'm going to write a story, and it's going to have characters and romance and explosions and all the things that good, hopefully, novels have. And then people relax and they say, all right, well, I want to learn about this story. And then I'd say, well, here's a little background information that I'm going to weave into the story so it doesn't feel like you're in your high school science class. It feels like, well, here's some relevant information for this story. But then when I was on my book tours for my sci-fi novels and I explained the science to people, not in the way the average scientist would explain it with the technical jargon, but just the way a storyteller who really is steeped in the science would explain it, I could see people's eyes getting wide because suddenly they got it. Not just they got the concept, but they got on a human level what this science meant for them and their children and their grandchildren. And that was when I realized that I needed to write the greatest story of all time, the nonfiction story, the story of our genetic becoming, the history and present and future of the genetics revolution that isn't just going to fundamentally transform our healthcare, it's going to transform the way we make babies, the nature of the babies we make, and ultimately our evolutionary trajectory as a species.
Give us some crazy things. I mean, what does the next 50 years look like?
So in this area, I certainly think that we as humans are going to increasingly stop conceiving our children through sex. We'll still be sexually reproducing species, but we won't be conceiving through sex because we're going to take the conception outside of the body so that science can be applied to the embryos. We're very likely to use stem cell, induced pluripotent stem cells, so that we will be able to make many more eggs. So right now, average woman has about 10 or 15 eggs extracted during IVF. And if you're doing embryo selection, that's a relatively small number. So let's say you start with 10, and then you say, well, I want a healthy life and long life, and maybe you want to choose in gender in some jurisdiction where that is legal, not unlike China. you don't have that many options. But if you take, for example, a skin graft with millions of cells, induce those skin cells into stem cells into egg precursor cells into eggs, now you can have 10,000 eggs. Fertilize those with the male sperm, and now you have 10,000 early stage embryos. And through an automated process, you grow them about 5 days, you extract and sequence a few cells from each. And then how far can we go with that kind of embryo selection? Well, you think of our ancestors, they took wild chickens laying 1 egg a month, and knowing nothing about genetics, just with selective breeding, turned them into domesticated chickens laying 1 egg a day. They took proud wolves, and knowing nothing about genetics, just with selective breeding, transformed them into little yapping chihuahuas and teacup poodles people are carrying around in the purse. And now, on top of that, we have these tools of precision gene editing. A lot of people know about CRISPR, but we're going way, way, way beyond CRISPR with incredible precision. And so we are going to be remaking the code of life. And it's probably too much power for one species. And we are just one little type of hominin that climbed down from the trees and stretched to look over the savanna grass. And this is a lot of power, and we better hurry up and get wise. And then on top of that, we're not going to be able to stay on this planet forever. We know this planet is going away. We know our sun is eventually going to implode. So we have to be thinking about, if we want to survive, which I certainly hope we will, we're going to have to become a spacefaring species. And we can't do it with the genetics that we have. So all of this stuff, it feels like sci-fi, it feels like magic, but I think a lot of it is going to become real.
The first genome editing experiment started in the 1970s on mice. Since then, scientists have discovered how to repair human genes carrying inherited disorders and eliminate mutations that can lead to disease. There's also new technology called CRISPR, which can be used to edit genes. It will likely transform the medical landscape and eventually change the world. You talk about Down syndrome some, and how parents can see that as a blessing that their child has Down syndrome, but now people have choices late stage, like, geez, what am I going to... There are choices that are going to be made along the way. What do you see in terms of diseases? What's going to happen in the future as a result of that?
Yeah, so Down syndrome is really sensitive because I speak about this stuff a lot, and when there are people in the audience who have friends or children or relatives who have Down syndrome, they say something that I agree with. They say, well, I have a child with Down syndrome. Are you suggesting that my child has any less reason for being than somebody who doesn't have Down syndrome? And I always say, not at all. Anybody who exists deserves the equal right to thrive and realize their potential as everybody else. But that's not the question that we're going to be asking. The question we're going to be asking is, if you have 15 embryos in a dish, and you know one of them will, if taken to term, will lead to a child that has Down syndrome, will you select that embryo for implantation? And we know the answer to that question because right now in places around the world that are doing non-invasive prenatal testing, NPT, in Northern Europe, it's about 97% abortion rate once there is a diagnosis of Downs. And so I think that parents increasingly, when given the choice, because you don't know any of these kids, they're all your natural offspring, to select one that does or isn't, has or won't have a deadly genetic disorder, people are not going to pick to implant those embryos with deadly genetic disorders. But once we're sequencing those early stage embryos, we're going to get all of the information that a sequenced genome provides, and that extends way beyond healthcare.
So do we edit out diseases moving forward?
We'll edit out some. And we have lots of diseases that our ancestors suffered from that we don't suffer from now. And in a way, that's a good thing. I mean, if somebody's already born with a deadly genetic disorder, we have to do everything we can to save them. But if we're choosing embryos, and it's so sensitive because we're right on the line of eugenics, this is really sensitive stuff, and it has to be treated sensitively.
But I guess people who would have objections to this, and I'm sure you've heard this argument before, is when it comes to editing, though, we can go with your model, which is the lighter hair, blue eyes, or mine, dark hair, and well, that may be a little bit more favorable, and so we see a world where everyone sort of looks more like you and less like me. I mean, this is you hear this a lot,
yeah,
I'm sure.
And that's the real danger, because when we talk about diversity, people feel like, oh, diversity, it means we're going to have a more inclusive workplace or more inclusive universities. But from an evolutionary perspective, diversity is what Darwin called random mutation. And that translates into resilience of our and every other species. So if we didn't have diversity, we wouldn't even still be single-cell organisms. Those single-cell organisms would have died because when the environment changed, they would have been the same and they wouldn't have survived. So it's diversity that allows us to survive. And we don't know what the world is going to look like in the future, or which traits that are not desirable now will be essential to our survival in the future, like sickle cell disease. If you have the sickle cell disease, you're going to die a painful early death. But if you're a recessive carrier of the sickle cell mutation, you have increased resistance to malaria. How many recessive disease states may protect us from future challenges that we can't even imagine today? We don't know it. And that's why there's this conflict between the individual and the collective, because the individual is incentivized to maximize their well-being now. And from a societal perspective, we have an incentive to maintain and perhaps even extend the diversity of our population as a whole. So at very least, we really need to be celebrating diversity and really warning ourselves against following some narrow genetic path, and whether it's preferencing a single type of intelligence. There are many different types of intelligence, or a single type of state that will allow us, that will reduce disease risks, but maybe we're doing harm that for the future that we can't foresee. So we really need to be mindful of celebrating and maintaining our diversity as a species. In my view, societies need to establish parameters of what is and isn't okay. We can't just have a genetic free-for-all. We're talking about the future of life. And within those parameters, though, I think parents should be empowered to make decisions that they see as being in their interest. But to do that, we need a massive education campaign, not just about the science, but about the ethics, about the trade-offs. Because this science is happening. We can't stop the science. It's not science yes or no, it's science yes. But how it happens, that's really the essential question at hand.
In 2019, Jamie was appointed to the WHO's Advisory Committee on Human Genome Editing. The group is developing global standards for genetic engineering, standards that would prohibit actions like the ones taken by researcher He Jian-Hui, who used CRISPR to create and implant gene-editing embryos.
We need to have global dialogues that can develop norms that can underpin national and then international governance structures, including regulations. With the world of climate change, there's a whole infrastructure of meetings and treaties and all of that. None of that really exists in the world at the intersection of AI and genomics. And I think, and I've been calling a lot for this, we need a new UN body, and everyone poo-poos the UN, but the problem of the UN is not really the UN itself, it's the states that are not empowering the UN to fulfill this transnational function that we need from it. So we need to have some kind of international body that's helping with global education and outreach, that's helping to develop norms, that's helping to share national regulatory best practices, that's helping to bring countries together, at very least, to determine red lines beyond which we shouldn't go. And we've done this. I mean, the Nuremberg trials tried to establish, well, what constitutes dangerous human experimentation? It's my view that the work that He Jiankui did and others did in China constituted dangerous human experimentation. So I think that we need to have standards because we're talking about the future of life and we're all one species, and we need to build out that infrastructure. And every country, particularly China and the United States, as in many ways the two world standard setters, need to come together to try to find a way forward together.
We talk a lot about income inequality, but what about genetic inequality? Because that's definitely going to be the forefront. If I've got money,
right,
and I've got the IQ, and my kids got the advantage because I grew up in this neighborhood, right, and they don't, describe that scenario moving forward.
Yeah, so we really need to be worried about genetic inequality, because you can imagine scenarios where wealthy people have the opportunity to screen their embryos to select of the range of possibilities that they have, maybe the embryo that has the highest, at least, genetic potential for having a high IQ, and you can imagine making those choices over the course of generations, that could be a self-fulfilling prophecy, even if it doesn't work, because people could grow up feeling that they have that advantage, or other people could feel that. So I think we definitely need to be worried about it. But think about our children, almost all of our children, the people watching this program. What's the difference between our children and children born today in war-torn countries like the Central African Republic? I mean, those kids are born in a war zone, in many cases to malnourished mothers. And so from the moment of their birth, their brains are impaired from the terrible nutrition and the stress and being in those war zone environments. We should be as concerned about that today, because that's a huge differential of opportunity, as we are about this potential future. And if we want to know where we'll be in the future when we face these decisions, as I think we will, we need to look at our world today. If those are our future values, let's make them our present values. That's point number one. And point number two is access to all of these technologies exists within the regulatory context. So there are countries like Israel where a lot of these technologies, like in vitro fertilization and embryo screening, are covered under national health plans. There are countries like the United States where in most cases they aren't. So that's a regulatory decision. And that's why I think we need to be thinking about, well, what are our visions for the kind of society that we want to be? And then just one final quick point. Talk about people in these Cambodian refugee camps with whom I've worked. I'm sure that as long as there's proper nutrition, that the range of IQ, the range of capability is just as great at people in refugee camps all around the world as it is with people here in Washington and wherever. And once we start sequencing everybody, which will happen over the coming decades, we're going to realize that there are people who we're thinking of as treating like they're throwaway people, like people languishing in refugee camps or in slums or whatever, that have at least the genetic potential to be the world's greatest scientists, mathematicians, sprinters, what have you. But we are throwing away human potential. So people are really worried that people are going to be pigeonholed, and that is a real concern. But there are a lot of people who are just throwing away, and we're going to discover that there's a lot of incredible capacity that just isn't realized.
Let me ask you one final question. If you go to your website, and I found this really intriguing, you have actually a menu. Bring a group together, have this meal. Yes. You even say, put the corn in the microwave.
Yes.
I mean, it was very detailed, very funny.
Yeah.
You've got a bunch of questions.
Thank you.
And I thought about that, and I thought about those conversations happening all over the world over these dinners. What are you hearing from people?
So this is my mission in life. This future is coming. everybody needs to be part of the conversation about where we should go. And I want to make it fun and easy and accessible for people. And I'm thrilled that with this book, people are having a lot of those conversations, and book clubs are reading it and having conversations. A few people are doing these dinners. My parents did one in Kansas City. And I'm hearing people, once they weigh in, a lot of people are saying, well, I was scared because it's science. But then I realized it's not just about the science. This is just about what it means to be a human. And I think when people really dig into this stuff, they come to this, I think, inevitable conclusion that that this technology is incredibly exciting, and who doesn't want to fight terrible diseases and live healthier and longer and protect their parents and their children? And who isn't afraid that these very powerful technologies could be abused? I think everybody gets there. And then once they do, they feel empowered. And that's my goal. I think that the scientific community sometimes disempowers people with all the jargon and making things inaccessible. And we need experts. But this is something everybody needs to have a say. So far, so good. It's just, as I mentioned, my goal is a species-wide dialogue. And there's a lot of humans out there, so we have a lot of work to do.
Several meals to come.
Yes,
Jamie,
exactly.
Jamie, thanks so much.
Really my pleasure, Mike. Thank you.